Look at your hand, not a metaphor. Actually look at it. The color you're seeing right now, that specific shade, is the result of a 300,000-year argument between your ancestors and a star 93 million miles away. And the star won every round. But here's the part nobody tells you. Winning looked completely different depending on where you were standing. Today, your species shows up in something close to 100 visible shades. Most people assume that's random. A slow, meaningless drift, like how languages split into dialects over centuries. That assumption is comfortable. It is also almost entirely wrong. If this is the kind of question you want to spend more time inside, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. 300,000 years ago, every human being on Earth was the same color. Dark skin. No exceptions, not one outlier on the entire planet. Dermatologists still use a 6-category chart, the Fitzpatrick scale, to predict who burns and who doesn't. For 97% of our history as a species, that chart would have needed exactly one box. So the question isn't why humans are different colors today. The question is, what broke the original design? Stop 100 people on the street. Ask them. Most will say something like, it's just genetics, like eye shape, a trait that drifted apart for no particular reason. But skin color isn't a random drift. It's closer to an instrument reading, an extremely precise historical record of exactly how much ultraviolet radiation a population's ancestors needed to block, and how much they desperately needed to let in, refined across hundreds of generations of trial and brutal error. To understand why, you have to stop thinking of skin as wrapping paper. Start thinking of it as hardware. It's your largest organ. Running dozens of jobs simultaneously that you never consciously register, regulating temperature, sensing pain, holding fluid in, keeping pathogens out. Buried inside that job description is one task that turns out to explain almost everything. Filtering light. Think about a camera. Every lens needs an aperture, a mechanism controlling exactly how much light reaches the sensor. Too much and the image overexposes, burned out, destroyed. Too little and the image starves, dark and underexposed. Your ancestors needed a biological version of that aperture, and they built it from a pigment called melanin. Melanin doesn't just darken skin. It absorbs ultraviolet radiation before it can punch through to the layers of tissue where your DNA actually lives. More melanin, narrower aperture, less radiation gets through. Less melanin, wider aperture, more gets in. And here's where the first assumption gets demolished. There is no universally correct aperture setting. There is only the correct setting for wherever your ancestors happen to be standing. Stand in equatorial Africa, and the sun isn't a gentle presence drifting across the sky. It sits almost directly overhead for most of the year, firing UV at an intensity most of the modern world never experiences even once. Under those conditions, a wide-open aperture is a slow-motion catastrophe. Ultraviolet light doesn't politely bounce off skin. It tears into chemical bonds inside cells. It scrambles DNA. Most of the time, the body's repair systems catch the damage instantly, silently. You never notice a thing. But every so often a mutation slips through unrepaired. And if it lands in exactly the wrong gene, a cell starts dividing without permission. That is the origin story of melanoma, one of the most lethal cancers in existence, and its risk scales almost in lockstep with lifetime UV exposure. So in equatorial Africa, evolution did the only logical thing available to it. It slammed the aperture shut, more melanin, more shielding, fewer mutations, longer lives, more children raised to adulthood, compounded across hundreds of thousands of years and uncountable generations. That single advantage hardened into something close to a biological mandate. Dark skin wasn't fashion. It was load-bearing infrastructure. There's a second twist buried inside melanin itself, worth a brief detour, because not all melanin is built the same. One form, HumanEvolution, is dense, brown to black, and an excellent UV blocker. Another form, Melanin, is reddish-yellow and noticeably worse at the job. A variant in a gene called MC1R nudges a person's pigment production toward pheomelanin instead of eumelanin, which is the entire reason redheads exist, along with their pale, freckle-prone, easily sunburned skin. Freckles, by the way, are basically the skin throwing up sandbags wherever it can. Tiny, localized emergencies. It also turns out the aperture runs on two completely different clocks at the same time. There's the slow one, your baseline inherited melanin level, the setting evolution spent hundreds of thousands of years calibrating across populations. And there's a fast one, a tan. Step into strong sun, and within days your melanocytes ramp up production temporarily, darkening skin as an emergency response to UV already detected, then quietly dial back once the exposure stops. It's the biological equivalent of a camera's auto-exposure kicking in mid-shot. A short-term correction layered on top of a setting that took millennia to fix in place. One adjusts in days. The other took a species. And if you want to see exactly how much work melanin is quietly doing, look at what happens when it's simply absent. People born with albinism produce almost none of it, regardless of their ancestry. In equatorial Africa, that means an aperture that never closes at all. Without specific sun protective measures, this population faces dramatically elevated rates of skin cancer, sometimes appearing decades earlier in life than in the surrounding population. It's a kind of unintentional natural experiment, running in real time. Take the shield away completely, anywhere near the equator, and the sun stops being indifferent and starts being lethal almost immediately. The cancer story should have been enough. Dark skin, UV melanoma, case closed, full stop. But researchers kept looking at the African data, and something refused to add up. Cancer, it turns out, wasn't even the most urgent problem, folate. Most people couldn't name a function for it if their life depended on it. It's a B vitamin, unremarkable, forgettable. It is also the reason skin cancer alone never fully explained the African data, and the reason this story gets significantly stranger. In 2000, two researchers, Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin, went looking for the missing piece. The problem with cancer, as the only evolutionary pressure, is this: melanoma mostly kills people well past their reproductive years. And evolution is notoriously indifferent to what happens to you after you've already passed on your genes. If cancer were the only pressure at play, the selection for dark skin should have been weaker than the data showed. Something else had to be pushing just as hard, and pushing earlier in life. The clue had actually existed since 1978. A pair of scientists named Brander and Eaton had floated a similar suspicion about UV and folate in a short paper that mostly sat unread, the right clue, decades too early, missing the wider framework to make sense of it. Jablonski and Chaplin's contribution wasn't discovering the clue. It was finally assembling enough pieces around it to see the whole shape of the mechanism. Folate, that unremarkable B vitamin, turns out to be one of the most time-sensitive molecules in human reproduction. Your bloodstream needs it constantly, but never more urgently than in the first weeks after conception, often before a woman even realizes she's pregnant. Folate is essential for sealing shut the neural tube, the structure that becomes the brain and spinal cord. Fall short of it at exactly the wrong moment, and the consequences range from severe lifelong disability to a pregnancy that never makes it to term. It matters on the other side too. Folate is necessary for healthy sperm production, which means this isn't only a story about pregnant women, even though that's where the sharpest danger sits. The neural tube closes in roughly 28 days. There's no second attempt, no patch applied later. Whatever raw material is or isn't available in the bloodstream during that narrow window determines, permanently, whether it closes correctly. 28 days. That's the window. That's the entire window. Here's the clue that completed the picture. Ultraviolet light breaks folate down. It happens directly in the bloodstream, just beneath the skin's surface. The instant UV penetrates deep enough to reach circulating blood. Which means in a high UV environment, a wide-open aperture wasn't only a cancer risk decades down the line. It was an active, ongoing threat to the next generation, in real time every single day. Picture two women, same Rift Valley community, similar age, walking the same sun-scorched paths every day because that's simply what staying alive required. One has skin that filters out most incoming UV. One doesn't. Across a single pregnancy, the difference might mean nothing. Across a population, across thousands of pregnancies, across tens of thousands of years, that difference becomes the entire reason the aperture closed as tightly as it eventually did. Two separate biological alarms, one about cancer, one about reproduction, were both pointing at the exact same solution: close the aperture. Add melanin. Survive long enough and well enough to pass it on. By every measure evolution cares about, dark skin in equatorial Africa wasn't merely favorable. It was close to non-negotiable, which makes the next chapter of this story almost absurd. Because that same trait, the one evolution had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting into something close to flawless, was about to become a liability the moment people started walking north. Somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, without any single dramatic departure, without a map or a declared expedition, small groups of humans began drifting beyond Africa, a few extra miles each generation. A river followed instead of crossed. A herd tracked one valley further than anyone's parents ever had. Multiply that drift across thousands of years, and humans eventually occupied the Middle East, Europe, Central Asia, and far beyond. The further they walked from the equator, the more the rules of the game quietly inverted beneath their feet. At higher latitudes, sunlight doesn't fall straight down. It arrives low and slanted, dragging through far more atmosphere before reaching the ground, scattering and weakening along the way. Winters stretch long and grey. In some regions, weeks pass without a fully clear sky. The same star, doing the exact same thing it always does, suddenly delivers a fraction of the ultraviolet intensity it does at the equator. Picture a small group, 35,000 years ago, huddled around a fire built into the mouth of a limestone shelter somewhere in what would later be called France. Outside, snow has been falling for days. The sun, when it appears at all, slips behind the tree line by mid-afternoon. Wrapped in stitched hides against the cold, almost no bare skin is exposed to sunlight for months at a stretch, which only deepens the UV famine on top of an already weak winter sun. The tightly shut aperture, the one that had been such an asset, was now blocking radiation that nobody up north needed protection from. Radiation that happened to be doing something else essential. Cancer and folate weren't the only items on ultraviolet light's job list. There was a third task. And at northern latitudes it became, by far, the most urgent one. When UVB rays strike a compound just beneath the skin's surface, they trigger a reaction that produces vitamin D. Your skin, in other words, doubles as a solar panel. Vitamin D isn't a minor nutrient you can shrug off. It governs how your gut absorbs calcium and phosphorus, the raw materials your skeleton is built from. Run short of it long enough as a child, and bones fail to mineralize correctly. Legs bow outward, the skull softens, growth stalls. The disease has a name, rickets. Run short as an adult woman, and the pelvis itself can soften, turning childbirth into something far more dangerous than it should ever be. Now picture a population that migrated north, still carrying the tightly shut aperture built for the equator. Their skin was doing precisely what it had been engineered to do, blocking ultraviolet light, expertly, relentlessly. The problem is that up north, blocking UV also meant blocking vitamin D synthesis. The aperture couldn't distinguish between radiation worth keeping out and radiation the body was now desperate for. It simply closed. The way it always had, bones weakened. Births grew more dangerous. Children grew more slowly, and evolution, running the same cold calculation in reverse, began rewarding anyone whose aperture happened to sit a little wider than their neighbors. Here's where the story takes its first major unexpected turn. For decades, the working assumption was that this lightening happened smoothly, a gradual drift over tens of thousands of years, the natural byproduct of simply living at higher latitudes, generation after generation. Ancient DNA blew that timeline apart. In 2014, researchers sequencing the genome of a roughly 7,000-year-old hunter-gatherer found in a cave in northern Spain, known in the scientific literature as the La Branja individual, got a result nobody fully expected. After thousands of years of his ancestors living in Europe, this man still carried genetic markers for notably dark skin, paired with strikingly pale blue eyes. That combination looks almost contradictory to modern intuition, because we've come to associate blue eyes with very fair skin. The expected story said, "Leave Africa." Drift gradually lighter, done. The evidence said something stranger. Thousands of years living under grey northern skies, and the aperture had barely moved. So what finally forced it open? Not the migration. Something that happened thousands of years later. And almost nobody outside the field connects it to skin at all. If you're finding this useful, a like takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps this reach people who'd want to see it. Back to the story. Roughly 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, a sliver of time so recent it represents less than 3% of the full 300,000-year history of our species, something shifted in how humans fed themselves. And it hit the vitamin D problem from a direction nobody had anticipated. For tens of thousands of years, hunter-gatherer diets in the north had quietly been compensating for weak sunlight. Fatty fish, organ meats, shellfish, foods dense with dietary vitamin D, topping up whatever the skin managed to synthesize on its own. It wasn't a perfect system, but it bought time. Then agriculture arrived. Diets built around wheat, barley, and other cereal crops are calorie-dense, storable, perfect for feeding settled, growing populations. They are also almost completely empty of vitamin D almost overnight. In evolutionary terms, an entire dietary safety net vanished. Populations that had been scraping by on a combination of weak sunlight and vitamin D-rich food were now leaning on sunlight alone. And if their skin's aperture still hadn't widened enough, that single source simply wasn't sufficient. A second accelerant compounded the effect: population density. Hunter-gatherer bands were small, scattered, loosely connected. A beneficial mutation could take an extraordinarily long time to even reach the next valley. Farming villages were different. Large, settled, networked, with neighboring villages through trade and intermarriage. A single advantageous gene variant could spread through thousands of descendants within a handful of generations, instead of dozens. Diet collapse plus population density turned what had been a slow multi-millennial drift into something closer to a sprint, visible in the archaeological genetic record within just a few thousand years. It's exactly why that lone hunter-gatherer from northern Spain could look so different from a typical resident of the same region today, despite his ancestors having lived there for millennia already. This wasn't the last time the vitamin D problem would resurface in European history, either. Fast forward to 19th century Britain, and physicians were treating an epidemic of bowed legs and stunted children so common in industrial cities that it earned a grim nickname: the English disease. The cause wasn't ancient migration this time. It was coal smoke. Soot-choked skies over Manchester and London blocked out enough UV to recreate, almost perfectly, the exact vitamin D crisis that had driven depigmentation thousands of years earlier. Same villain. Different century. Different mechanism for blocking the same sunlight. None of this timeline would even be knowable without a fairly clever forensic trick. When a gene variant gets aggressively favored by selection, it doesn't just become common. It drags the stretch of DNA sitting next to it along for the ride, since there hasn't been enough time for normal genetic shuffling to separate them. Geneticists call the telltale signature. This leaves behind a selective sweep, and finding one in the genome is essentially finding a fingerprint at the scene, proof that something, recently, forced this exact variant to spread unusually fast. It's how researchers can look at a population today and say, with real confidence, not just that their skin lightened, but roughly when, now. Given everything we just established, a straightforward equation: weak sunlight drives lighter skin, there's a population that should be the most obvious data point in this entire story. The palest people on Earth should logically live in the Arctic. They don't. Inuit communities in northern Canada and Greenland. Sami reindeer herders above the Arctic Circle. All noticeably darker than neighboring populations at similar latitudes. This puzzled researchers for a long time. The answer turned out to be diet, just running in the opposite direction. Traditional Arctic diets are built almost entirely around fish, seal, and whale, some of the richest natural sources of vitamin D that exist anywhere on the planet. When your dinner is already solving the vitamin D problem for you, there's far less pressure on your skin to solve it too. The aperture never needed to widen, because the food was doing the job sunlight couldn't. It's the cleanest proof available that this entire story was never really about latitude. Latitude was just a stand-in for the actual variable evolution was tracking: how much usable vitamin D a population could realistically get, by any means, sunlight or otherwise. Change the food, and you change the pressure on the skin, no matter how weak the sun overhead happens to be. Which raises an obvious next question. If the aperture responds to that many variables, sunlight, diet, latitude, time, how many separate genetic knobs does it actually take to operate it? The answer is going to unsettle something you probably assumed without realizing it. Skin color isn't controlled by a single gene flipping between dark and light like a switch. It's a polygenic trait, dozens of different genes, each nudging melanin production, melanin type, or melanin distribution by a small amount. For much of the early 20th century, scientists assumed otherwise, that pigmentation followed simple, single-gene dominant and recessive rules, the same logic used to explain pea-plant colors in a high school biology class. That assumption made it tempting to treat skin tone as a clean, rankable marker, a single dial separating one group of humans from another. Modern genetics dismantled that picture completely. A trait built from dozens of interacting genes, distributed along a continuous gradient with no natural breakpoints, was never going to sort cleanly into ranked categories. The biology simply doesn't cooperate with the idea. And here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Europeans and East Asians both evolved significantly lighter skin than their equatorial ancestors, independently, on separate continents, under broadly similar low UV pressure. And they largely used different genetic tools to get there. A variant near a gene called SLC24A5 played an outsized role in lightening European populations. East Asian populations leaned on a substantially different set of variants, including changes near genes like OCA2 and MFSD12, to land in a comparable range of pigmentation. There's even evidence that a small piece of the European lightning picture may trace back to interbreeding with Neanderthals, who had already been living at those latitudes and adapting to that light for far longer than Homo sapiens had. Two separate populations, thousands of miles apart, never in contact, arrived at strikingly similar outcomes through almost entirely different molecular paths. Biologists call this convergent evolution. And it tends to show up only when a pressure is strong enough and consistent enough that nature essentially reaches for the same general answer more than once, using whatever raw genetic material happened to already be lying around in each population. When evolution invents the same solution twice, independently, that's about as loudly as biology ever signals that a trait actually matters. These same genetic markers have a strange afterlife in the present day. Crime labs and ancestry testing companies now routinely scan a small set of these pigmentation-linked variants to estimate what a person likely looks like, or where their ancestors likely lived, from nothing but a DNA sample. It's called forensic DNA phenotyping, and it works because the signal evolution carved into those genes over hundreds of thousands of years turns out to be precise enough to reverse engineer, sitting quietly in a single cheek swab. 300,000 years of survival pressure, visible in a cotton swab. So what does any of this mean now, in a century with sunscreen, vitamin D capsules, fortified milk, indoor lighting, and central heating? It means the aperture your ancestors spent 300,000 years calibrating is still installed in your body, still quietly running on instructions written for environments that, for many of us, none of our living relatives have set foot in for generations. That's why dermatologists still hand patients a 6-category card. The cancer risk that shaped equatorial skin for 300 millennia hasn't gone anywhere. It's just that people with low melanin apertures now frequently live somewhere with intense seasonal UV their bodies were never tuned for. It's also why vitamin D deficiency is disproportionately common among people with high melanin skin living at high latitudes today. The exact mismatch problem northern hunter-gatherers fought, just running in reverse, driven now by global migration instead of tens of thousands of years of genetic drift. Public health surveys in countries like the UK and Canada repeatedly turn up the same pattern. Residents whose ancestry traces to equatorial regions show measurably higher rates of vitamin D insufficiency than their pale-skinned neighbors in the exact same weak winter sun, same equation, same star, different bodies. Different outcomes. It's the same arrangement struck 300,000 years ago. It just changed its enforcement mechanism, from mutation to multivitamin, from migration to an airplane ticket. Every time two people whose ancestors stood at opposite ends of that old migration map have a child together, a configuration of those ancient aperture settings comes together that has never once existed in 300,000 years of this species walking around. Not better, not worse. Simply new, the same old algorithm, fed an input it has never seen before, producing an output nobody could have predicted in advance. One more thing worth knowing before zooming back out, because it reframes the entire category of skin color itself. Map average skin tone across the globe by latitude, and you don't get 6 clean boxes like the dermatologist's card. You get a smooth gradient, darker near the equator, gradually lighter toward the poles, steepest exactly where ultraviolet intensity changes fastest. Biologists call this clinal variation, a continuous slope, not discrete categories. The 6 tidy boxes are useful medical shorthand for predicting cancer risk. They were never how biology actually organized itself. the same evolutionary logic shows up in other traits too. The ability to digest milk into adulthood evolved independently, more than once, in separate cattle-herding populations across Europe and Africa, for nearly the same reason, a useful nearby resource and a mutation that let you keep using it past childhood. Different trait, same underlying machine, step back far enough, and this entire story stops being about skin at all. It's about a single population standing under one unbroken African sky, splitting apart, wandering in every direction a habitable planet would allow, and quietly, invisibly, recording every mile of that journey in a pigment nobody was consciously choosing. Every shade of human skin alive today is a kind of receipt, proof of how much light some ancestor needed to block, or beg for, in order to survive long enough to become you. None of it was ever a hierarchy. None of it was a verdict on anyone's worth. It was one indifferent star doing exactly one thing, the same way for everyone, everywhere, and a single species answering that one thing in however many ways it took to make it through. The aperture is still adjustable, still being written, generation by generation, every time a population moves, every time a diet changes, every time two ancestral lines that have never met before finally do. 300,000 years in, and the instrument is nowhere near finished being tuned. So here's the question worth carrying out of this with you. Every single one of your ancestors, going all the way back to a single shade that had no number on any chart yet, spent their entire life adjusting to the exact amount of light they happened to be given, without ever knowing they were doing it. Look at your hand again. What is your skin still adjusting for right now that you haven't even noticed yet? If this changed how you think about something you've looked at your whole life, share it with someone who'd feel the same way. Subscribe if you want to keep going. There are more stories like this one waiting.